History Secrets.
In the Gospels of the New Testament, the childhood of Jesus appears only in a few brief episodes. The birth in Bethlehem, the visit of the shepherds, the flight into Egypt, and a singular episode in which Jesus, still young, speaks with the teachers in the temple. Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52, describes this moment in Jerusalem. After that, the biblical text simply states that Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and grace. And then the narrative moves directly to the beginning of his public ministry. But this gap sparked great curiosity in the early Christian communities. What happened during the silent years of Jesus' childhood? This question led to the emergence of several ancient texts, now known as apocryphal Gospels. These manuscripts attempted to imagine and narrate episodes from the childhood of Jesus that do not appear in the canonical Gospels. Some of these texts describe miracles performed even in childhood. Others present curious stories about Jesus' relationship with his family and the people around him. Among these ancient documents, two texts became especially well known: the so-called proto-evangelium of James and the infancy gospel of Thomas. To understand these lesser-known narratives, we must first understand why these texts were written. To understand the emergence of these writings, we need to return to the early centuries of Christianity. During this period, many communities sought to preserve traditions, stories, and reflections about the life of Jesus. The Gospels that are now part of the New Testament were written approximately between the years 60 and 100 of the Christian era. But during that same period, and in the centuries that followed, various other writings began to circulate among different Christian groups. Some of these texts sought to answer questions that the canonical Gospels left open. One of these questions referred precisely to the childhood of Jesus. If Jesus performed extraordinary miracles during his adult life, what might have happened during his childhood? Some communities began to imagine episodes that would reveal early signs of his special nature. Thus emerged narratives that attempted to fill the silence between the birth of Jesus and the beginning of his public ministry. These stories were recorded in texts that we now call apocryphal Gospels. The word apocryphal means hidden or not recognized as part of the official canon. This does not necessarily mean that these texts were unknown. Many of them circulated widely in certain regions during the early centuries of Christianity. Among these writings, one of the oldest and most influential is the proto-evangelium of James. The proto-evangelium of James is one of the most well-known apocryphal texts related to the childhood of Jesus. Most scholars believe it was written around the 2nd century. Although the text is attributed to James, the brother of Jesus, historians consider this authorship to be likely symbolic. The document does not focus only on the childhood of Jesus. Much of the narrative describes events related to the childhood of Mary, the mother of Jesus. According to this text, Mary's parents were named Joachim and Anne. They are said to have faced a long period without children, which was seen as a source of great sorrow at that time. According to the proto-evangelium of James, after a period of prayer and supplication, an angel announces that Anne will have a daughter. That child would be Mary. The text states that Mary was dedicated to the temple from a very young age. There she would have spent part of her childhood being educated in a religious environment. This tradition does not appear in the Gospels of the New Testament, but it became extremely influential in later Christian tradition. Many artistic representations of Mary's childhood were inspired precisely by this apocryphal text. The Proto-Evangelium of James also presents additional details about the birth of Jesus and introduces characters that do not appear in the canonical narratives. But there is another apocryphal gospel that focuses directly on the childhood years of Jesus, a text known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is one of the most curious apocryphal texts related to the early years of Jesus' life. Most scholars believe that this document was written between the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Unlike the Proto-Evangelium of James, this text focuses directly on the childhood of Jesus. It describes episodes that would have occurred when Jesus was still a child living in Nazareth. Some of these stories present a surprising portrayal. Jesus appears performing miracles from a very young age. In one of the most well-known episodes, the text describes Jesus playing by the edge of a small stream. He shapes little birds out of clay. When someone rebukes him for doing this on the Sabbath, Jesus claps his hands, and the clay birds come to life. They take flight before everyone. This scene became one of the most well-known images associated with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. But not all the stories in this text present a peaceful atmosphere. Some episodes describe moments in which the young Jesus displays a power that is difficult to understand. In certain narratives, his words produce immediate and unexpected consequences. These accounts show a child figure who is still learning to deal with an extraordinary power. Some episodes of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas are particularly surprising to modern readers. The text describes moments in which the young Jesus reacts intensely to everyday situations. In one of the stories, a child bumps into him during a game. According to the narrative, Jesus speaks words that cause the child to fall lifeless. The reaction of the community is immediate. The child's parents and the inhabitants of the village are frightened by what has happened. In another episode, a teacher tries to teach Jesus the alphabet, but the situation takes an unexpected turn. Jesus begins to question the very meaning of the letters and the origin of knowledge. The teacher finds himself unable to answer the child's questions. These stories present a very different portrayal from that found in the canonical Gospels. Here, Jesus appears as a child with extraordinary power, a power that is not yet fully integrated into his human understanding. As the narratives progress, however, the text shows a gradual change. Jesus begins to use his abilities in a more compassionate way. He heals people, he helps workers, and he restores lives. This evolution suggests a process of growth, a path of maturation leading to the teacher who appears in the Gospels of the New Testament. As the narrative of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas continues, the episodes begin to present a more balanced image of the young Jesus. The text begins to highlight miracles that demonstrate compassion and care for those around him. In one of the stories, Joseph is working as a carpenter. During the construction of a bed, one of the boards is shorter than the other. The mistake could ruin the entire work. Then the young Jesus holds one end of the wood and stretches it until it becomes exactly the required length. This episode presents a curious image. The child Jesus helping his adoptive father in simple tasks of everyday life. In another account, Jesus heals a young man who had fallen from a roof. The community that once feared his powers begins to perceive something different. These stories seem to attempt to show that the child's extraordinary power is gradually being directed toward good. The text suggests that the wisdom of Jesus grows over time. This idea reflects a passage found in the Gospel of Luke. Luke, chapter 2, verse 52, states that Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and grace before God and men. Thus, although it is an apocryphal text, the infancy Gospel of Thomas seems to engage in dialogue with elements present in the canonical Gospels. When scholars analyze the apocryphal infancy Gospels, they seek to understand why these texts emerged in early Christian communities. One of the most evident reasons is the natural curiosity about the silent years of Jesus' life. The canonical Gospels offer only a few episodes from his childhood. After that, the narrative moves directly to the beginning of his public ministry. For many readers of antiquity, this long period of silence raised inevitable questions. What was the childhood of someone considered the Messiah like? How did he behave as a child? The apocryphal Gospels attempt to answer these questions in a narrative form. They use stories that reflect both religious imagination and the spiritual expectations of the communities that produced them. Some of these accounts present Jesus performing miracles from a very young age. Others emphasize the role of Mary and Joseph in his upbringing. These stories were not included in the New Testament, but they reveal something important. During the early centuries of Christianity, there was great interest in understanding every aspect of Jesus' life, even those that had not been recorded in the well-known Gospels. When the leaders of the early Christian communities began to define which texts would be recognized as part of the New Testament, many writings were carefully evaluated. Some Gospels were considered compatible with the tradition transmitted by the apostles. Others were seen as later accounts or narratives that reflected local traditions. Among these texts were the infancy Gospels. Documents such as the Proto-Evangelium of James and the infancy Gospel of Thomas were not included in the official canon. This occurred mainly because these writings were produced decades or even centuries after the events they describe. In addition, many of their stories were seen as narrative expansions that did not possess the same historical authority attributed to the canonical Gospels. Even so, these texts continued to circulate in various regions. They influenced popular traditions, religious art, and narratives transmitted throughout the Middle Ages. Some stories about the childhood of Mary and Jesus that appear in paintings and Christian traditions were directly inspired by these apocryphal Gospels. Thus, although they are not recognized as part of the official Bible, these manuscripts played an important role in shaping the religious imagination of many communities. They preserve a window into the diversity of narratives that existed in the early centuries of Christianity. When we observe all these texts together, we realize that the apocryphal infancy Gospels reveal something very interesting about the history of early Christianity. They show that curiosity about the life of Jesus was not limited only to the episodes recorded in the Gospels of the New Testament. Many communities also wanted to understand the silent years of his childhood. The accounts preserved in these manuscripts attempt to imagine what that period might have been like. Some stories describe extraordinary miracles performed by a child. Others present simple moments of everyday family life in Nazareth. These narratives cannot be treated in the same way as the canonical texts of the New Testament, but they hold important historical value. They reveal how different communities reflected on the identity of Jesus and the meaning of his presence in the world. They also show how the Christian tradition was gradually shaped over time through debates, interpretations, and different forms of storytelling. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these apocryphal Gospels is precisely the mystery that remains. Between the birth in Bethlehem and the beginning of his public life, there is a period about which we know very little, and it was precisely this silence that inspired some of the most curious stories preserved in ancient Christian literature. Throughout history, many events have been recorded, but others have disappeared over time. Lost manuscripts, forgotten accounts, evidence that never reached us. But this raises an inevitable question. How many truths of history do we really know? Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.